Called The Bark of Dante, and is taken from the great poem by the late medieval Florentine poet Dante, who has this poetic journey from hell through purgatory to paradise. And what Delacroix takes is hell and the inferno. The bark is the small boat in which Dante himself is sighted, clad here in red, with an amazing expression of surprise and terror on his face. And next to him is his accompanist, the great Roman poet Virgil, who has this serene expression on his face with a laurel leaf on his head. And then next to them, with his back turned to us, is the boat keeper from the river Styx, Phlegeus, who is struggling to get through this lake that surrounds the infernal city of Dis. And all around, the damned are trying desperately to be saved and to get aboard the boat. The inspiration for the work, Dante, was oddly enough rare in French art, even though Dante had fueled Italian art for the previous 5 centuries. No major French salon painter had ever attempted this subject matter. But of course, the real inspiration for this subject is clear. It's Jericho's Raft of the Medusa, and the drama and the lighting and the subject matter of figures struggling to get on board a boat. But I think what also struck the contemporary eye, and certainly what strikes us looking at the work, is the detailing, not just the expressions, but look at the way that colour's used. Now, Delacroix becomes one of the great colourists in Western art, but here it's very subtle, particularly in the way that the droplets of water are painted, where instead of using the usual greys, he uses a mixture of red and green and yellow and white. What he says is the palette of creation, the rainbow, rather than the muted colours that have usually been used. And this work was acquired by the French state, and the reaction critically was one of astonishment rather than admiration. But nonetheless, the feeling was there that here was the next young talent in French art. Shortly after completing The Bark of Dante, Delacroix began to keep a journal, leaving us an extensive and fascinating insight into the workings of the artist's mind. I am carrying out my plan, formulated so many times, of writing a journal. A writer has to say almost everything in order to make himself understood. But in painting, it's as if some mysterious bridge was set up between the spirit of the persons in the picture and the beholder. We ought to steep ourselves from time to time in great and beautiful works of art. Delacroix now organised all his attempts to make great and beautiful works of art with the salon in mind. The next one was scheduled for 1824. And this was the work that Delacroix exhibited. Larger, bolder, brasher than The Bark of Dante, and entitled Scenes from the Massacres at Chios. Now, Chios was a Greek island that had recently been attacked by the Turks after the Greeks had proclaimed independence in 1822. And what had happened was that 90,000 inhabitants on this island had been subjected to over 2 months of burning, pillaging, looting and raping, to the extent that there were less than 1,000 left. The rest had been killed or deported for slavery. And Delacroix had both read contemporary newspaper accounts and also interviewed eyewitnesses. But in the end, that was a springboard for his imagination. The painting's dominated by the figures in the foreground, who are all the Greeks who are awaiting death or slavery. They all seem to be paired up, from the woman crying, leaning on the shoulder of the man who's been injured, to perhaps the most touching scene, the young child searching for his mother's nipple for nourishment while his mother lies dead. Again, one of the noticeable things about the painting is this detail and colour, not least in the red around the old woman's eyes, flecked with green. It's complementary. And then look at the shadow on her arm. Red once again, but again flecked with green. But then there's the drama of the Turk on horseback, dragging off this woman whose clothes are falling from her, as a young Greek man tries to protect her. And then we move to the middle ground, where there's another massacre taking place, where the Turks are there with guns and swords, killing a group of Greeks. And then in the shadows, we notice the spectre of the Turkish guards holding their guns. And so what we have is a scene of individual episodes brought into one, where ultimately everything seems utterly chaotic. And the critical reaction to the work was, on one hand, people said this was the new wild man of French art, and others said Delacroix has massacred painting. And this work helped to polarize the situation in France. There became a battle, if you like, between classicism and the art that had been put forward by people like David, idealness, beauty, order, harmony, and its antithesis, romanticism, the subversion of classicism, naturalism, emotion, the idea of sketchiness and speed and intensity. And all of those things Delacroix stood for. The Massacre of Chios was bought by the French state for 6,000 francs, which Delacroix used to fund a trip to London. This 3-month journey was highly significant. Young artists tended to opt for the classical splendours of Italy, but Delacroix made it clear that his interest was in contemporary art, and in particular the emerging British school, notably Constable and Bonington. This art he saw as a breath of fresh air in comparison to the rigidity of French painting, but it was English literature which partly inspired his next major work. In 1828, Delacroix was back in the Salon to produce what turns out to be the third of the great 3 early works, and an image that he called his Massacre No. 2, and a painting that is still the most radical work he ever painted, and it's called The Death of Sardanapalus. Sardanapalus was the Assyrian king who lived in the palace of Nineveh in the 9th century before the birth of Christ. But the precedence for the painting, for Delacroix, was a play written by Lord Byron in 1821 and subsequently performed in Paris. In Byron's play, Sardanapalus kills himself along with one concubine because the rebels are at the door of his palace of Nineveh. But in Delacroix's painting, the king lies almost languidly, like some reclining Venus, on this giant, billowing pink bed, with a concubine next to him pleading with him that her life isn't taken. But all around him, people are being killed by his eunuchs and by the palace guards. There's a potion of poison being brought, and in the top right-hand corner, we can see the billowing flames just beginning, as if to tell us that shortly everything will go up in smoke. And it's almost like an image of a latter-day cult, where everyone is condemned to die, but at the centre of it all is this kind of mystical, enigmatic, cultish leader. For many people, this painting remains at the apex of romantic art. Brilliant colours, dynamic brushstrokes, a dynamic composition where the eye is always drawn over the painting. And Delacroix himself said, "I really hate organised painting. My disorganised mind has a void, this dark void he talks about, that needs to be filled." And in a way, that's what's going on here. And the subject matter is extreme too. Suicide was favoured by romantic artists and writers like Goethe. But here, by expanding it into a mass suicide, Delacroix was deemed to have pushed his art off the edge. And that, sadly, was the broad consensus amongst both critics and the public, that this was almost a delirious image. And this time, the state didn't buy the painting, but it remained among Delacroix's favoured works, and it still strikes a chord. It still has this sense of energy and subversion. It's a total subversion of everything that classical art and order stood for. In 1822, when Delacroix had first shown at the Salon with the Bark of Dante, he was an unknown artist. Now, just 8 years later, though, he was at the very heart of the French artistic establishment. But Paris was soon to become embroiled in political and military turmoil, which in turn led to Delacroix's most famous painting. Delacroix lived in turbulent, revolutionary times, and it was this energy and excitement that fueled the best of his painting. When Delacroix was born, Napoleon Bonaparte had seized power, proclaimed himself emperor, and ruled over France and much of Europe for the next decade and a half, only being defeated in the end by the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. There then followed the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, who at least ostensibly understood that there was no going back to the pretensions of the Ancien Regime. Nonetheless, they did try and establish a regressive, repressive Catholic monarchy, which in effect was turning the clock back. And on the 25th of July, 1830, the repressive King Charles X abolished the freedom of the press, dissolved the Chamber of Deputies, and altered the election laws. And in turn, the people of Paris rose up in revolution, which gave Delacroix the subject for his most iconic large-scale work. And this is Delacroix's pictorial response to the July Revolution, a painting called Liberty Leading the People, painted between October and December in a rush of creative energy by Delacroix, who tries to combine fact and fiction to affirm that he was there by showing his signature on a piece of gnarled wood in the right-hand side of the painting. And also, as he says, I didn't fight, but at least I can paint for the country. But look at the composition and you realise that this is a very carefully constructed and quite ordered painting by Delacroix standards. At the pinnacle of this pyramid is the figure of Liberty, a combination of a working-class girl and some kind of classical statue, with her breast revealed rather tokenistically, but I suppose to show that she can also be mother of the people, a kind of nourishing figure. And then down below her, there are various carefully observed types of working-class figures. On the left-hand side, clutching a sabre, there's a factory worker. Then in a top hat, holding a gun, slightly up the social scale, is an artisan. And then kneeling at the feet of Liberty is a country labourer. On the right-hand side, the young boy clutching two pistols. And then to the right of the boy, clearly visible amidst the billowing clouds of smoke, you can see Notre Dame, as if to affirm that this is contemporary Paris, even though this would not have been possible to see in quite this way. But nevertheless, Delacroix wants to say, this is my world. But of course, at the apex of the composition is the flag, is the tricolour. And if you look at the colour throughout the painting, which is muted by the standards of Delacroix's previous art, there's this very subtle build-up of red, white and blue, found throughout the work, but there proclaimed as the pinnacle. And there is something very ordered and almost classical about this work. It's as if Delacroix has stepped back from the extreme edges of Romanticism to something relatively more controlled. It's also a picture that struck a huge chord, both with critics and public alike, when it was exhibited in the 1831 Salon. And as a consequence of this work, Delacroix received the Légion d'honneur. Now, it's become an icon of the French Republic. Delacroix's official status was further enhanced in 1832, when he was invited to go to Morocco as part of an official delegation to see the Sultan. France had recently conquered Algeria and was very keen both to allay Moroccan fears and also to re-establish a new relationship between the two countries. And for Delacroix, the journey would shape the course of his art for the rest of his life. Once here in Morocco, the exotic Orient that had only existed in Delacroix's imagination suddenly started to seem real, and his world was filled with new sensations, smells, sounds, and of course, a new vision. Each part of the 6-month trip was documented through Delacroix's journals and his letters, and most significantly, his sketchbooks. The majority of his time was spent in Tangiers, immersing himself in a culture that was largely unfamiliar, but which through Delacroix's images became a mecca for Western artists over the next few decades. Whilst in Tangiers, he was invited to a Jewish wedding, which he subsequently painted. He shows the contrast of light streaming into the courtyard with the dark shadows on either side. The Jews are on the left with the woman dancing, and then the Moors on the right, all observed from above, from beyond the balustrade, and then, of course, from down below, by implication, by the painter. After 6 weeks in Tangiers, the entourage were given orders to travel to the imperial city of Meknes for an audience with the Sultan. Finally, after a week of waiting, a crowd gathered here. There were standard bearers and musicians and cavalrymen and people just looking at what was about to happen. And then the Sultan appeared at the Bab al-Mansour, the gateway to the imperial city. It was an event which burned itself into Delacroix's imagination and inspired this canvas some 13 years later. Delacroix stayed in Morocco for another 3 months, leaving for France on the 10th of June and going via Algiers and Spain on the way home. The trip filled his sketchbooks and his imagination, and it equipped him for a full-blown and seductive assault on the Parisian art world. Back in France, Delacroix completed and then exhibited perhaps his greatest and certainly most accomplished painting from the Moroccan journey. It's called The Women of Algiers in their apartment, and it was shown at the Salon in 1834. On one level, this painting reaches new heights of naturalism. There's a kind of documentary realism about the work that stems from the fact, as we know, that Delacroix made sketches in an actual harem in Algiers from which much of the work is based. But we also know, too, that it's still rooted in that slightly exotic, other kind of fantasy that dominates the Western imagination. The work can also be read in the context of France's colonisation of Algeria. Harem, or haram, means sacred, and in a way, by depicting this scene, Delacroix is making that space seem less sacred, less mysterious. However, what he's doing in this work is also showing, or trying to show, the harem as it actually was, and not as some kind of caricature of Western sexual fantasy. For a start, the women are clothed. There's plenty of limbs around, but they're not sprawling naked and therefore explicitly sexualized. They seem ultimately in control. They seem remote and self-contained. And although the painting's intimate in the way that the detail of the still life, the slippers, the cushions, the rugs, the pipe, is painted in the foreground, the women also act as a kind of veil or a screen to what lies behind, which is in turn revealed by the black servant who's pulling the curtain away to reveal something of the inner mystery of the harem with the door open, but we only get a flickering, fleeting glimpse. And ultimately, it seems a painting of mood. It's that languid, sensual late afternoon where the shadows are falling, creeping in from the left, and where colour, as always in Delacroix, has this amazing sense of control, but also of procession. And this is a painting that, when the critics saw it in the 1834 Salon, left them to a certain extent nonplussed. People said nothing is happening here, and because it was on such a large scale, they expected something of the drama of Delacroix's previous history paintings. But in a way, what he's done here is much more subtle. It has this much more subtle, hedonistic atmosphere to it. And it's this painting, perhaps above all others, that has struck a chord with painters of future generations. Matisse adored this painting and was partly driven to go to Morocco as a consequence of it. Picasso did variations on it. The Spanish filmmaker Luis Buñuel said he could almost smell the incense in the picture. And perhaps most memorably, Paul Cézanne said, looking at this picture, it enters your eye in the way that a glass of wine slips down the throat and in the end leaves you feeling intoxicated. Soon after Delacroix's return from Morocco, he was given the first of a series of commissions for decorative projects in public and private buildings around Paris. The first was for the Palais Bourbon, or the National Assembly as it's now known. Here in the Salon du Roi, initially built as a throne room, Delacroix painted a frieze running around the top of the room, punctuated by window arches, filled with allegorical figures, highlighting the key aspects of a successful state: justice, commerce, industry, agriculture, and war, all supported by 8 large columns or piers on which Delacroix painted allegorical figures representing the main rivers of France and the surrounding oceans. Such was the success of the Salon du Roi that Delacroix was then asked to decorate the Bourbon Palace's library. For 8 years, struggling with ill health, he painted 2 half-domes and 5 large bays, a vast pictorial saga of the rise and fall of classical civilization and learning. At one end, the lyric poet Orpheus brings enlightenment to the early Greeks, whilst at the other, Attila the Hun and his hordes overrun Italy and the arts. In between, the bays are filled with ancient classical and biblical stories, which Delacroix believed to embody the main subjects of any library: history, philosophy, poetry, science, eloquence, law, and theology. And then, in 1854, Delacroix finally began to work on an illustrious commission he'd actually received 5 years earlier, to paint 3 murals for the Church of Saint-Sulpice. In the small Chapelle de Saint-Ange, lit only from a stained glass window, Delacroix painted 3 works that emphasized the struggle between good and evil. Here, Jacob wrestles with the angel. The Emperor Heliodorus is driven from the temple whose treasures he was trying to seize. And finally, the Archangel Michael defeats the devil and proclaims the triumph of God. While Delacroix was working on the Saint-Sulpice murals, he became involved in a project in 1855 by the French government to respond to the great exhibition that had taken place in London 4 years earlier. The new imperial regime of Louis Napoleon wanted to assert French superiority in commerce and the arts, and in order to do this, he staged an Exposition Universelle in which there were pavilions of work by living artists from each country. And Delacroix was given pride of place with his first major retrospective exhibition, as well as being made a member of the French Academy. Late recognition for an artist who'd played the salon system so effectively, but whose impact transcended it. For Delacroix offered an expansive, highly original and often exotic vision, which over the ensuing decades was to inspire artists and filmmakers from Manet to Louis Buñuel. Delacroix never stopped painting until his strength finally deserted him. Art was an all-consuming affair for him. He never married because, as he put it, he needed nothing else in his life apart from painting. But in the winter of 1862, he caught a cold and then contracted a severe virus. And although he was looked after by his trusty maid Jenny, he died on the 13th of August, 1862, having supposedly uttered his last words, "I had enough in my head for another 40 years."